Right, so thank you for stopping by. I'm Aaron Latanzi, and we'll be talking about stochastic methods for capturing dispersion in particle-laden flows. So as a bit of motivation, really we're going to be focusing on inertial particles that will be transported by a dynamical fluid. And this has a lot of relevance to industrial as well as natural systems, which can be seen in catalytic riser reactors, clustered flows, or even our quintessential fluidized bed. Now in these systems, we'd like to be able to quantitatively predict the dynamics, whether it be particle residence time, cluster formation or breakup, and even integral time scales, or integral length scales for that matter. Now, in order to do this, we're going to need coarse-grained Euler-Lagrange methods that can capture the hydrodynamic physics. Really, we're going to focus on here is the generation of particle velocity variance as well as particle dispersion. More specifically, we're going to focus on inertial particle suspensions, so density ratio greater than 100, moderate to dense solids loadings, so solids volume fractions in the order of 10 to 40%, and then moderate Reynolds numbers on the order of 10 to 100. This will all be done in the context of a two-way coupled Euler-Lagrange framework. So taking a look at the drag force acting on a collection of particles, we know that it's been pretty well established that a particle-laden suspension will exhibit significant variation in the drag about the mean. And that's to say that each particle in the suspension does not exhibit or does not feel the same exact drag force. And we can see this very quickly through a scatter plot of the drag force exerted in a suspension, as well as looking at just say the normal pressure forces exerted on the surface of a sphere. More affectionately, this has been referred to as the neighbor effect in quite a bit of the literature. Now, existing drag laws in Euler-Lagrange frameworks fail to capture the velocity variance and the dispersion, the question being why. So if we consider a very simple system where these different particles are distributed in our box, we'll quickly identify that our coarse-grained EL is going to basically smear out the microstructure. So each one of these systems could have the same Reynolds number as well as the same solids volume fractions. Consequently, we would compute the drag to be identical on all particles. So if we go back to our equation of motion for a particle, we see that our mass by acceleration being offset by our collisional force over all of our contacting particles, our undisturbed fluid velocity, and then we have a surface integral of our unresolved fluid stress. Now, for an isolated sphere, we might quickly jump to the classic Maxey-Riley equation, where this integral could be is comprised of a quasi-steady drag, an added mass, or even a Basset history. Now, for a suspension, things become a bit more complex, and really, what we want to do is not try to tease out each individual contribution for a dynamic suspension, but really try to build up a stochastic drag framework that accounts for these effects, but really kind of at its heart builds in the drag statistics that are present within dynamical particle-laden flow. So to put this on a little bit firmer footing, we note that a multitude of particle-resolved DNS studies have observed drag distributions that are Gaussian in nature. And this has been done in the context of unbounded flows, fixed particle suspensions, as well as freely evolving suspensions or even bounded fluidized beds. What we'll then proceed to do is expand our drag force via this integral of our unresolved fluid stress into a mean and fluctuating component. And what we want to do here is really specify our drag statistics, such as our distribution or even our time correlation through this fluctuating component. And this can be done in a deterministic sense, such as the pipe model or even probability distribution maps. We're going to utilize the stochastic Langevin framework. We'll note that our mean drag could be modeled with really any chosen correlation. Our collaborators have done quite a bit of work in this area, specifically for fixed particle assemblies. Dr. Tinetti has a great correlation that's been developed. More recently, Dr. Tavanashad extended that work to lower density ratios as well as freely evolving suspensions, where we could actually compute contributions due to the so-called thermal drag or neighboring particles that have finite velocity variance. So the big introduction here is this fluctuating drag force, and how do we model that? We're going to utilize an Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process, which has two closures, being the standard deviation in the drag force, as well as the integral timescale of this fluctuating drag. In our recent work, we consider basically analytically deriving what results from this fluctuating drag treatment. And what we show is that the steady solution to our Ornstein-Uhlenbeck process gives us a drag fluctuation distribution that is Gaussian. Additionally, the OU process is going to give you a Lagrangian autocovariance function that is exponential. And what we see is extracting the same statistics from particle-resolved DNS, there is a consistency here. Moving on, we see that the fluctuating drag force now introduces a source into our particle velocity variance as well as our particle dispersion. And the big takeaway here is that we are not randomly introducing our drag fluctuations. We are designing a stochastic differential that yields statistics which are consistent with particle-resolved DNS. And this fluctuating drag force now gives us a reason for these particles to build finite granular temperature velocity variance and then undergo dispersion. So we need to close these two inputs into our stochastic differential. And the first one we're going to examine is the integral timescale of the fluctuating drag force. And this can be directly computed from particle-resolved DNS. But going through that theoretical procedure in our previous work, we have reason to approximate this with the mean free time between successive collisions, which should be valid for high inertia particles. And we'll note that this solution is really agnostic to the particle resolved DNS data, since it's derived from the kinetic theory of non-uniform gases. The physical insight here is that the force velocity covariance is what's going to give you a source to your granular temperature. So as particles are under a state of free streaming, that velocity vector is going to become correlated with the fluctuating drag. So the particles are accelerating in the direction of our fluctuating drag force. If we have these random correlations, they will eventually scatter the particle velocity vector and break up that correlation. So the longest time scale for this force velocity correlation to occur is the mean free time between successive collisions. But this introduces a little bit of a challenge in that we now need to compute on the fly our granular temperature. So in order to do that in our Euler-Lagrange framework, we're going to utilize an adaptive Gaussian filter method, which has been developed and validated within our group. Specifically, the Lagrangian data is projected onto an Eulerian mesh with an adaptive Gaussian filter. And this filter is designed to sample the 10 nearest particles. So in regions that are very, very dense, the filter becomes very compact, but in regions that are devoid of particles, that filter becomes very large. The idea then is that by going through this adaptive projection procedure, we ultimately compute our granular temperature with a local phasic average. And this is going to give us the random uncorrelated motion, which means that the granular temperature we're computing should be accurate for predicting the collisional frequency, even in inhomogeneous flows. So we also need our force standard deviation, and this is going to come from particle-resolved DNS data. Specifically, our collaborators at Iowa State have done some great work with their pure IBM code, specifically looking at these fixed particle assemblies. Dr. Tavanashad and Professor Subramaniam really draw a nice analogy with what they've done for mean drag, which was shown to collapse when normalized by the drag on an isolated sphere. And what Dr. Tavanashad really does is show that we can do the same type of thing for the drag force standard deviation. And what we'll see is that over a range of Reynolds numbers and solids volume fraction, the normalized standard deviation by the drag on an isolated sphere collapses very nicely. And we can then basically compute our standard deviation in almost the same manner that we compute our mean drag, where we've utilized a fit to the data that is a polynomial in solids volume fraction. And this is designed to tend to zero in the infinitely dilute region, which means that we don't have neighbor effect contributions if there aren't any neighbors. The real takeaway here is that really there's a solids volume fraction correction to mean drag for a suspension. So basically this correction appends the drag on an isolated sphere, but we also have the same type of correction for the standard deviation, which is very nice for computing these quantities in our EL framework. So the framework we're utilizing is NGA, which is a low Mach solver, and it employs local volume filtering. We'll utilize second order convective and viscous schemes, which give rise to really the classic conservation equations for our fluid phase. And then we'll be utilizing Lagrangian particle tracking with a soft sphere method. So we'll resolve those multiple enduring contacts. The big change to our Lagrangian particle tracking is that our interphase exchange term has not just our undisturbed fluid velocity as well as our mean drag, but now this fluctuating drag that we're modeling from a stochastic differential. The two-way coupling is done via a Gaussian projection kernel. So we're going to be projecting our interface term from our discrete particles back onto our Eulerian mesh. The Gaussian kernel in this case is fixed width, which is in contrast to the granular temperature, which has that variable filter. The system we'll be validating against is homogeneous fluidization. And this has been extensively studied with particle-resolved DNS. Essentially, it's a pretty simple system where it's a triply periodic cube. We have a force mass flow rate up through our particle suspension, and we have a gravitational body force that's going to offset that. We have elastic particles, so we're not considering collisional dissipation, and we'll start off with a random initial configuration. We know from PRDNS that the particles will evolve to a steady granular temperature, which is defined by our triple point, our density ratio, our Reynolds number, and our solids volume fraction. From this, we can define two kind of canonical flows. Specifically, we'll start off with the fluidized homogeneous heating system, where particles are initialized with no velocity variance. And then in time, that granular temperature grows to a steady value, quote unquote, it heats. By contrast, we have the fluidized homogeneous cooling system, which is the exact opposite. We have an overprescribed granular temperature, and then basically, eventually it cools down to our steady granular temperature. And we'll initialize this system with the Maxwellian velocity distribution. So looking at the fluidized homogeneous heating system, we'll consider a fixed solids volume fraction and density ratio and run a sweep across different Reynolds numbers. What we'll see is that the particle-resolved DNS shows that we grow in granular temperature until we sustain our steady value, which is what we would expect. By contrast, the standard Euler-Lagrange method does not evolve in time in this manner and does not sustain the correct granular temperature, but the new stochastic force-Langevin method does, and it does it quite well. So we see very strong agreement between stochastic EL and PRDNS for the homogeneous heating system. Looking at the homogeneous cooling system now, we can consider two initial conditions where we have overprescribed granular temperature, and we look at how the system cools back down to our steady granular temperature. And again, we see very strong agreement between stochastic EL and PRDNS, whereas standard EL cannot resolve the sustainment of granular temperature at steady state. Looking across different solids volume fractions, what we'll see is with a fixed Reynolds number and a density ratio, the stochastic EL is again performing quite well, capturing the temporal evolution as well as the steady value for granular temperature, but the standard Euler-Lagrange method does not. So it's not a matter of looking just at a particular regime where it's poor. We're seeing that a lot of different Reynolds numbers, a lot of different solids volume fractions, we're just not able to capture the granular temperature with standard EL. Finally, we look across density ratio, so for a fixed Reynolds number and a fixed solids volume fraction. And really, it's the same story. The stochastic Euler-Lagrange method captures the temporal evolution and the steady value across these different density ratios, while standard EL is just incapable of doing so. So the big takeaway here is that we're looking at a stochastic approach for neighbor-induced drag forces, and we validated the suspension dynamics in our stochastic EL framework without tuning parameters. Specifically, we looked at higher density ratios, higher solids volume fractions, and moderate Reynolds numbers. We show that this stochastic drag framework acts as a source to granular temperature, and that has implications on improving Euler-Lagrange, as we've considered here, but as well as like the two-fluid model or Euler-Euler. Very specifically, some recent work came out looking at the compressible Euler-Euler equations and showed that such sources could improve the regions of hyperbolicity. So now with this stochastic force-Langevin method, we see that we get convergent granular temperature. And this is really because we've imposed the drag statistics through our fluctuating drag force. And this is going to mitigate the dependence upon our grid size or our emulsification kernel width. Now for future work, we could improve our FL inputs through looking at lower solids volume fractions, lower density ratios, so the standard deviation, the integral timescale in those regimes, as well as kind of highlighting the fact that our framework is inherently two-way coupled. So our fluctuating drag force is sent back to the fluid phase. And we know that there should be some type of balance relation with the fluid pseudo-turbulent kinetic energy. So going through the exercise of deriving that and looking at what the PTKE is in the fluid phase would be very valuable. And then finally, I think this really is just kind of the start to where we could potentially create a modeling paradigm for unsteady contributions, be it added mass and mass A history. So thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll be available at my Q&A session.